Hey everybody, and welcome to our regularly scheduled multi-tenancy working group for Kubernetes meeting. Today, Adrian's going to give us a quick update on HNC, and then Jim is going to do an update and a demo on the latest in the multi-tenancy benchmarks. So Adrian, you want to kick off?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, my camera is not working today. So Ryan who's not on the call today, Ryan has been working hard to help HNC graduate out of the incubator directory in our GitHub repo. So for those who don't know, traditionally working groups did not have their own GitHub repos, but there were so many things going on with multi-tenancy that we had our own repo and we started building a bunch of stuff in there. So virtual clusters started life in there, and I believe is still hosted there today. HNC did, and so did all of the multi-tenancy benchmarking projects. However, the idea was always that at some point we would graduate to a full-fledged repo that's sponsored directly by one of the SIGs, as opposed to the working group. So we have now gotten our KEP, our Kubernetes enhancement proposal, merged to create a new hierarchical namespaces repo underneath Kubernetes SIGs in GitHub. So thanks to Ryan for driving that and getting us to that state. So there's basically only there's two decisions we have to make. One is, when do we do this? And so we'll probably do this migration over the next couple of months. This is a good time for HNC because HNC is really stabilizing. We've added a bunch of new features, but our roadmap is currently just at this point stabilization. So this is a good time for us to be switching from one repo to another because there's not a ton of activity. The only other thing that we needed to discuss was whether or not we wanted to change our API name. So all APIs in HNC right now begin with hnc.xk8s.io. Where xk8s is a prefix that's reserved for anything that's in Kubernetes SIGs but hasn't been formally approved as a Kubernetes API. Now that we are becoming a sort of official project, we have the option to change that to just hnc.k8s.io. And this, of course, would cause disruption to any existing customers, but would look more official. That's pretty much the only benefit to this. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say that. If we ever did graduate to being, for example, a core part of Kubernetes, then we would have to change to the standard Kubernetes API group. So you could say that the earlier we do this, the better. My feeling right now is that I don't actually want to make this change. I don't want to break our early existing users. I don't see a lot of benefit to it. It also will make any future change to the API much harder, as we'll need to get a formal API review for each and any change. And I don't think that we're at the state necessarily where we want to do that. But I haven't made a final decision as to what I want to do, let alone decided on behalf of the project what we're going to do. So if you have an opinion on this, please add it to the multi-tenancy working group channel on Slack, or email me if you don't know how to join the Slack for anybody who's new here. And we'll try to make the decision over the next couple of weeks. There's, as I said, not a ton of urgency here, but that's the only, I think, decision we need to make before we move on to the next step. So that's it from me. Other than that, HNC, we've released 0.7, which has a bunch of new features. The main new feature is exceptions, which Ginny contributed. I believe she's on this call, so thanks to Ginny. And other than that, as I said, we don't have a set of new features for 0.8. Right now, it's just going to be increasing stabilization as we move to, at some point, 1.0, which will probably be after we change repos. So any questions for me about HNC? That is our 2021 update, early 2021 update.
No questions, but congratulations. It's a great milestone, and good to sort of have that next step.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Okay, hearing no additional questions, again, please contact me via email. My email's on the HNC repo or through the Slack channel if you want to hear anything more. And that's it for me. So, thanks, Tasha.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, now handing it over to Jim to go over the benchmarks updates.
Okay. I think you need to let me share our screen or
Okay,
make me
yeah,
a host or
I'll have
something.
to
Or
promote you. There you go.
perfect.
Do we need to add anybody else for the presentation?
So I think Scott, who's also on, was gonna. Scott, I'm not sure if you had any slides or anything to present, or just wanted to kind of discuss. But we were going to talk. Yeah, so just in terms of context, and maybe before we dive into this topic, so what I was going to demo was some of the use cases that we're seeing with Kyverno, which is a policy management tool, and a CNCF sandbox project, and multi-tenancy. But before we dive into that, just to quickly mention and give, Tasha, you also talked about the benchmarks. So we don't have a demo ready for this session, but we will have something to demonstrate in the next session. What we're working on there is to now extend the benchmarks to work across namespaces. So far we're able to do benchmark in a single namespace, check for all the required multi-tenancy configurations. And one of the things I think, Faye, you had also mentioned is that it would be nice to do more behavioral tests. Like, for example, if network policies are configured, can we actually create two namespaces and make sure that two different tenants can, talk across applications? So things like that is what we're looking at next. So the next step was to extend, to allow the CLI and the tool to take multiple namespaces as inputs with multiple tenants for each namespace, and then to run these tests in an automated fashion. So we'll have something to demonstrate on that when we meet again in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, today what I wanted to talk about more is these patterns we're seeing with Kyverno, and I'll quickly introduce Kyverno for those of you who might not be familiar with what that is, and I'm going to focus more on namespaces as a service. And Scott, who is also, in the Kyverno community, has an interesting use case he's exploring with clusters as a service and using CAPI and Kyverno together. Okay, so just starting with a quick intro to Kyverno and what that does, and how it applies to. So Kyverno just in general is a policy management framework, and it applies to more than multi-tenancy, but here of course we'll focus on these two, namespace as a service and then clusters as a service. And I did, by the way, I installed HNC, and I was playing around with it and to make sure it's compatible with Kyverno, and there's some interesting things there which I'll demonstrate that can be done. So just in terms of why Kyverno and what makes it different from something like OPA or OPA, which is another policy engine in the Kubernetes community. So the whole intent is to make policies and policy management native to Kubernetes and not require different languages, or require or add sort of more paradigms or complexity to it, right? And um, also, in terms of policies, the focus here is not just to validate and enforce certain settings, but also, as you'll see in the demo, is to be able to mutate, generate different resources based on policies that are being set and extended. And then, because Kyverno is only focused on Kubernetes, it has the benefits and the ability to leverage a lot of the native patterns inside of Kubernetes, right? Like things like whether it's labels, selectors, annotations, making sure like owner references. So all of those type of things Kyverno can take advantage of, even, for example, between the relationship between pods and pod controllers, and as opposed to a general purpose policy engine, which doesn't have those kind of the knowledge of the Kubernetes specific domain. So the way it works, as you can probably envision with any policy engine, one of the main functions is to review admission requests, right? So Kyverno plugs in as an admission controller, and it is highly optimized in terms of how it processes these requests. Typically, admission controllers get 30 seconds. We've artificially set the deadline for Kyverno to be under 3 seconds to process any request. And that includes, validate, mutate, and other types of requests. And Kyverno also can operate as a background controller, so it'll scan your cluster for violations, report on these. And the policy reports it generates are, something which is being worked on in the policy working group. So even that is a custom resource. It's pretty easy to get namespace level reporting on what's going on. So quick example of what a policy looks like, right? And because this is intended to be, this policy is checking in the pod security context to the security context at the pod level as well as the container level, and it's making sure that run as root, for example, is set to true. So this is a validation rule, and those are useful to check for required configurations. But what we'll also see is the power of mutate and generate, and then of course combining these to achieve some task like automate namespace management. All right. So any questions on Kyverno before we jump into the namespace as a service use case, or? Okay. So for namespace as a service, and what Kyverno can do, and I think also like sort of showing how it will work with HNC. The interesting thing here is obviously to manage access controls for namespaces, right? And to say, okay, if a user is authorized or if a team is authorized to create namespaces, you want some clear ownership, and you want to make sure that they're identified as the person or a team managing or creating that namespace. The other thing that's very typical is, of course, you want common configurations. And this applies not just to sub namespaces like HNC solves, but also to, top level namespaces, right? So very typically within an enterprise, you will have several common configuration settings that you want to enforce. And I'll show an example of, something else that was shared with the Kyverno community of how users are addressing this using labeling and things like that. But it's typically, as we've seen with other controllers, so requiring standard labels, requiring naming conventions, generating defaults, things to that nature. And then also in another more advanced namespace, and one of my colleagues is going to do a presentation in the Valero community about this, is allowing more self-service for namespaces, right? So once a namespace is created, if let's say a user wants to request a backup, in the Valero use case, or in other cases, maybe if users want, let's say, their own monitoring or logging, those type of things can be automated using Kyverno and just using labels. So the idea is that to request this, the user would just create a label, and if they say monitoring enabled, then there could be automation in place through Kyverno to generate these services and configure them for that particular namespaces itself. So quick, kind of overview on where HNC and Kyverno could potentially work together, and how this, how we're seeing this play out, with some customers and users is. So this top level management of namespaces, which the administrator typically does, is something that Kyverno can automate, and I'll show mostly through the command line, but there's tools like Nirmata or other automation tools, and even integration with things like Argo CD, which can help with that. But the idea is to be able to fully automate. So create a standard set of namespace types, and to allow users to come in and manage those, and then automate what happens when that namespace is created. Now, of course, once the namespace is created, what HNC nicely solves is how can you, letting the namespace owner and namespace admin manage things from there on and create sub namespaces for their application itself, right? So this is, one pattern, one way of kind of using the two together to solve this problem holistically for an enterprise. Okay, so before I dive into the demo I prepared, just want to quickly share, like I mentioned, this is something Gregory also, who's been active in the Kyverno community, he shared this, and I don't think he was able to make the call today, but if, as you can see, like the use case he's trying to work out and what they have done here, it's fairly elaborate. So they're creating namespaces, with different business units and different network characteristics identified all through labels. And once they do that, they're using Kyverno to first of all identify, is this a request from a business unit or is this a request from an admin? Based on that, then further checking if that unit is authorized, if that unit based on certain settings, they can generate different role bindings, or even like if that unit is marked for PCI compliance, as in this example, then create certain additional annotations, additional configurations to apply to the workloads, maybe restrict based on network policies and node selectors, things like that. And then finally, of course, if there's like other network configurations or requirements, like in this case, if there's a DMZ label, make sure that workloads get tagged with that too. So all of this, again, this is just one example, and these are the types of customizations that may need to be done before a namespace is made available to the namespace owner or the team requesting it, and from there on they can do something more. The demo that I'm going to show is somewhat similar, but simpler, right? It doesn't go through all of those different use cases. But what I kind of just prepared, and this was, as I was playing around with HNC and thinking about what to demo yesterday, is I came up with, the first thing we see very common is auto labeling. So just having clear sort of ownership or who created this namespace, things like that. So I'll show an example of a policy for that. Then enforcing certain conventions for like, sizing or types. Now, I chose to do this through naming, but you could do, with Kyverno, it's fairly easy to do that through annotations or labels. And then generating, automatically generating not just role bindings, but also roles for that specific namespace. So like a named role for that namespace to allow that namespace owner to be able to then go and, of course, delete or view that one particular namespace itself. For the demo I did, I also, attached some HNC RBAC configuration to allow that namespace owner to go and then configure their hierarchy and manage that. And of course, generate role bindings to these roles, generating things like quotas, and in this case, quotas based on the sizing selected and other default resources. So here I have an example of a network policy. So those are some of the typical things that would need to get automated or done, and that's what I'll kind of showcase how that's done in Kyverno. Any questions, thoughts before we switch into, and I'll show what some of these policies look like, and we'll go through the example itself.
Looks pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's nice to see all of this come, when it sort of works end to end, and it automates quite a lot of different things. So just, and so I'm showing a policy definition in Kyverno where, and as you can see, it's just, YAML. It's very similar to Kubernetes configs. So what it's doing is this policy is adding a label to a namespace. It's excluding if the namespace is created by a cluster admin or HNC, it excludes that. But if the namespace is created by any other user, it will put in that username into a label created by, right? And this is all, of course, customizable, but that's one of the policy definitions I have. I have other policies here, like for example, the quota policy. This one is interesting, right? So it requires that every namespace, again, created by any roles, excluding these two, have to end with small, medium, or large. And then based on the selected one, I have policies here, which just set particular quotas. Now, in this case, I've just inlined the data, but it's possible to reference an external resource if you have these quotas managed in some top-level namespace in your cluster, right? So that's this is one other example of policy to generate resources. And then for the network policy, it's also pretty straightforward. It's just a policy to generate it, and similarly for limit range based on quotas and things, right? So those are the ones I have. And what I'm going to do for this demo is I'm going to use a cluster role, called NS creator, which I've associated. So I actually created an HNC admin role too. And we're going to use those two roles and through policies associate them to the person who's allowed to access this namespace. So let me apply. I'll switch to a cluster view. And if we do, let me make this a little bit larger. So here I have, as you can see, there's HNCs running, Kyverno is running, so I already have these installed. And I think I applied everything, but just to make sure, let's do this. All right, so this was the same repo I just showed in the Visual Studio Code. So it has these roles and these policies currently, right? So now that we have that applied, what I'm going to do is, first thing I'll do is I'll just create a namespace, which if I do this as an admin, I should be able to create any namespace, right? So in this case, I just created test and as an admin. But now if I try to do this, let's say I try to do test2, and I'm going to use the user, the namespace admin user I had was Nancy. So if I say as Nancy and try to do that, whoops, I want to say create namespace. The Kyverno policy kicks in and says, you can't do that because you're missing the required suffix, right? So it requires the small, medium, large. So let's create, this as that user. So now there's a namespace created, and if we do describe, and I want to do, so of course I can do a describe as an admin, but I want to make sure I can also view that namespace and look at the details as that particular user, in this case, Nancy. So if I, oops, let's say describe. I see that I have, a label injected by the policy we showed, right, which associates that namespace to that user. I also see I have a resource quota set, and I can see there's a, my limit ranger is also set. Let's see what else we have in this namespace. So if we get the network policy, we should see we have one of those. And if we do roles, or actually let's do role bindings, we should see that we have two role bindings, right? One for the namespace admin and one for HNC admin. So that allows Nancy to now manage and administer the namespace and the hierarchy there as well, right? So the next thing I want to do is show again, now if I, use the HNC kubectl plugin, and if I say, create, let's say S1, so as this user, I was now able to create, we'll just create a couple, and then we'll look at the tree. So I think this is, yeah, so I see, and I can not only was I able to create this, but I can view all of this, of course, because of the right permissions that were set up from before, right? And then the last thing to check and make sure is this user, because they own this namespace, they can also kind of clean up and delete and do things once they're done with that, right? So at this point, of course, they can run workloads and do whatever they wish in the namespace. But the last thing I want to show here is if I do delete, and I'm going to do sub namespace, which is the HNC resource. We'll just say minus minus all and minus n. So now as that, oops, I forgot to put as Nancy, but as that user also, I would have been able to delete that particular namespace, right? And let's make sure I remember that when I delete the actual namespace. So if I say delete namespace, it should allow me to do that because I have, rights to that one particular namespace. And by the way, just to make sure, if I, let's say if I do get, that group system, it should not allow me to see these other namespaces, right? Yeah. So let's go back and delete, which is what we were. So as this user now, I can clean up my namespace and everything, whatever work I did in there, right? And I was also able to manage the hierarchy. So that's a quick demo of, again, how Kyverno can help automate a lot of different things, which, maybe each one of these by themselves seems like a bit of configuration, but if, of course, within an enterprise, it quickly adds up in terms of what needs to be done. But the whole idea here is with something like Kyverno and HNC working together now, namespaces as a service, not just for the sub namespaces, but even doing that for the top level namespaces can be fully automated, controlled through policies, and it just makes things very easy to sort of manage end to end. So that's what I wanted to sort of demonstrate and just show some of the patterns and things that are emerging. Would love to get feedback, thoughts on these policies, more things we could do with Kyverno potentially. And also, would love to explore, again, more integration use cases between Kyverno and HNC and how the two can work together. Any questions or comments?
It's a great demo.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, feel free to reach out on Slack if things come up or just want to find out more info. And we're continuing to, of course, work towards several additional features in Kyverno for different types of policies and things we're applying. But the other topic I just wanted to also quickly mention, and Scott Rosenberg, who's also on, I'll let him kind of share this. It's a different use case for managing multi-tenancy with CAPI and Kyverno.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jim. Great to be here. And so, yeah, I was talking with Jim actually on the Kyverno Slack on about a use case that I'm currently building with Kyverno, which is actually integrating it with Cluster API. Hopefully in the future also with CapN, once that's allowed and running for the new virtual cluster implementation. But basically, the use case is to be able to provision clusters automatically when a namespace is created. The specific customer that this is being run at or being built for has a use case of basically they need to be, they're developing different CRDs and different controllers, and they want to be able to manage the deployment of clusters for their developers in a simple, easy manner. And cluster API on its own to deploy a cluster is a cluster that would be ready for deploying workloads would be a minimum of usually 13 different CRDs that would need to be deployed, plus more if you want any customization within the cluster. And the use case that came up was being able to use basically Kyverno to automate using generate policies all of the cluster API relevant resources. And then generating as well with that a role binding to allow the user that created that namespace access to cluster API creates the kube config in a secret local in that namespace. So basically allowing the user to automatically get that kube config. And then once he created a namespace within about 5 to 10 minutes, whenever the cluster is ready, automatically they can just get that kube config from the secret in the namespace and start running. And that cluster would be deleted at the moment that the namespace is deleted as well. So really an easy way of just kubectl create namespace and you get a cluster. And the real, now that also cluster autoscaler works together with cluster API and the whole ecosystem is really growing in that sense, it's really easy to create a default cluster with Kyverno here and then allow that to scale based off of the needs. So it's currently being prototyped in a POC, but this is the use case currently that I'm working on with Kyverno for multi-tenancy. So yeah, if there are any questions or thoughts, anything.
Yeah, no, Faye, Chris, and team, you guys have been also working on some, Gappy nested type implementations, right? And that's one thing I'd mentioned to Scott is to take a look at that as well and see if there's any potential synergies or anything else there that could be leveraged.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very good kind of a use case. Honestly, we haven't thought about exactly how to manage the CR stuff. So far, everything's manual. So yeah, no matter how VC works, you still need to have a centralized, like, the super cluster kind of thing. You still have a management issue on that. So I'm happy that Kyverno can help on that to, protecting the actual CR of the either Capian or Capi. But that's a great use case. I would agree. So honestly, I haven't thought about that. I was focusing more on the upper layer, but I do think this problem does exist because the cluster administrator has some, this is the burden of the cluster administrator. You need to manage those CRs anyway. You need to figure out a good way, how to manage. So in terms of the namespace wise, so we do with even Capian, we probably will slightly change the way we manage the super cluster namespace, which Chris and I have a kind of brief discussion, but we haven't made a formal decision yet. Some of the way that currently doing is more is for easy implementation perspective. So I use, the namespace for each virtual cluster, which has, basically there's no directly, correlation between where the CR locates and where the control plane locates. They're probably in different namespace, at least for now. They are not necessarily in the same namespace. Yeah, that's overall what I have a comment so far. I think indeed Kyverno as a, I would see is kind of automation is pretty good for automation. So you set up some rule and when you create a namespace, you hook Kyverno with kind of automated actions on that. Yeah. But by the way, for the Kyverno, so is API currently fixed? Or I see it's kind of complicated. It's not exactly complicated. There's some learning curve to learn the API. So I'm just wondering, what is the philosophy of design rules API? So is this I would say, you know, for things like this, the usability is always my first concern. So if I want to introduce to somebody else, I need to convince them, okay, this is a pretty good design, it's pretty easy kind of way to do this. Not exactly the best, doesn't have to be the best way, but
right. Yeah, no, that's a good question, right? So there is, and we do support, of course, full compatibility on the API itself. But yeah, just looking at the policy structure, so that's fairly stable, and we've kind of been. So Kyverno has been around now for close to about a year, and we've sort of battle tested this with several different variations and things like that. So that this common structure, like to do match, exclude, and then mutate, validate, generate, and then how to populate things. So by the way, you can get external data through config maps. You can get external data. So it's very easy if you have some other controllers to create a config map and extend your policy that way, right? So Kyverno remains pretty fast and stable, but as opposed to something like OPA where you can make external calls, we don't allow that in Kyverno for security reasons, but you can reference config maps which will be cached and used as policies. Yeah, so, but the basics of writing a policy, I mean, simple policies are simple. And I guess as if you go to more complex policies, of course, it gets a little bit, more complicated. But a very basic policy is just something like this, right? So you write validate, you write an overlay pattern, which was more or less inspired by what Customize does. And you write some wildcards to say what you want to match, things like that. So it's very minimal learning curve on top of Kubernetes.
So for the use case, typically you write, so you create one CR, or you create multiple CR. So you know what I'm saying? So if I have something to do,
yeah,
do you expect that I put everything in one class policy CR with a lot of rules, or you expect that I can separate it out?
It's very flexible, right? So here, for example, just to show, so PSPs, as probably everyone knows, are sort of on the path to being marked for deprecation. So if you want to replace PSPs with Kyverno policies, we have two based on the pod security standards. We have two levels, default and restricted. If I go to default, these are each are individual policies, right? So, and each policy can have several rules. So it's up to you how big you want to make a single policy. Ideally, you would group them in this manner. So each policy is doing one thing and it's sort of easy to maintain. So this becomes an instance of a policy and you would apply it to one or more namespaces or pods. And the nice thing is because it's just resources, all you need to do if you want to apply these is a single one line with Customize, and it will apply them to your cluster, right? So pretty easy to get that level of security up and running.
Yeah, I think as always, so if I want to talk about this with kind of multi-tenant, so I don't know if the problem exists or not, but do we assuming just one guy create roles policy, or so what if let's say I have two guys create two policies? Is there a way to make sure they are not conflicting each other, or?
Well, so I mean, some of this, just like if you were writing a controller and they're doing opposing things, then of course you have to manage that, right? But yes, typically an administrator would configure the policies, but you can have namespace level policies. You can even use policies to generate policies. But yes, I mean, ultimately, just like with any scripting or coding, you would have to make sure the policies are doing the right thing. But we do have there's a command line to test things, right? So it's very easy to test and validate results before you.
Sure. So that's actually come up by my previous question. Why I say should be writing one CR or multiple CR? Because even I'm the only one who wrote those policies. But if I wrote one CR, probably I can figure, I can realize I didn't create the conflict one. But if I write in 10 CRs, probably already forget what the first CR was doing. So yeah. So then come out the question. So if there is any conflict, is it possible to have a kind of detection or kind of.
So there are some validation checks that Kyverno does when you install the policy. So for example, if the permissions do not exist for the resource you're trying to generate, things like that, it will check. There's no, I mean, although it's possible for policies to do different things, yeah, we'd have to think more about which conflicts we want to automatically check for and things like that. But there is a validation module as policies are being installed, and you can also validate those offline in your CI.
Yeah, it's kind of obvious. Is you set class role binding for one role, you bind to one user, but you have another policy is don't bind the roles to that type of users, and you have a policy say, oh, please bind it. So
right, yeah, so that you would obviously, I mean, there's still, when you do policy as code, the idea is you would just test it like you would test with other code as well, right? So
yeah,
and you can do that offline and before it's introduced into your cluster, and check for conditions like that.
Yeah, cool. So I know this is kind of hard problem, but I'm just from
yeah.
Yeah, I guess if I could add to that, right? Like, so my concern with not having something like that is it'd be very often you would allow people to create new policies, but probably not delete existing ones. And so if they could create a policy that would allow them privilege escalation, essentially, because it would contradict. So I think some sort of validation would be super nice there, to prevent creating a new one to give a user more permission than they should allow.
No, so that Kyverno won't allow, just like with Kubernetes, you can't do that. You can't, assume more privileges than you can. So with Kyverno policies, you can't override another policy. So all of them apply, as a complete set. And if any policy denies that condition, it will still stand as a deny.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect.
You could also write a validating policy on a object of a policy, and then actually validate your policies with Kyverno.
That's a thing.
It's inception, kind of like cluster API, Kubernetes
Right.
managing Kubernetes, policy managing policies.
Well, again,
But yeah, I definitely see the integration with CapN being very interesting down the road. I think that could be a very interesting use case for what I'm doing now with CapV. With CapN, I think could be very interesting.
Yeah, I think overall that's kind of, you probably need to rely on have a super cluster domain that knows everything and that have a but that unfortunately is the truth, and you cannot have a dumper domain to operate on Kubernetes in order to make everything work.
All right, so I think that's what we wanted to present today, and certainly as maybe Scott, as your use case matures, I mean, it would be great to see a demo at some point, and certainly, if there's anything else on the namespace side, let me know, what we can do, or other example or sample policies we can help create. So thanks, Tasha. And I don't know if we had anything else on our agenda for today, or anything we need to.
Nope. I think we're good. The only thing that we have coming up for the leads is that we need to decide what we want to put in as our proposal for KubeCon EU. So if any of the leads have any ideas or proposals, send them over to me and we can work on that. But yeah, that was all of our content for today. If anyone has anything they'd like to discuss or go over at our next meeting, please feel free to throw it on the agenda and we'll cover it then. But thanks for that. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Real
Brian?
quick. Sorry. So I was a few minutes late. Did we already cover the X-K8s to K8s discussion, Adrian?
Yeah, we spoke about it
Okay.
briefly. We didn't have any conclusion. I just asked if people had opinions. They should let us know on Slack.
Great. Thanks.
So, and thanks in person or whatever this is.
Adrian, so for the group things, can you do automatic conversion, or is it possible?
What do you mean by automatic?
You have a controller, so if I use the old version of CRD,
we could. I can't say that really excites me very much. Like we just went through one conversion from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2. It's tricky. Now that was two different versions of the same CRD. This would be something even more custom, where basically as we read in one CRD, we would write out the new one and then delete the first one.
Oh, let me think about it. So can the controller, so do we need to have two controllers? I think controller can change version, but you cannot change.
Yeah, you would need to have basically two controllers. One that just did conversions. It would probably be easier to write like a one-time tool that just read everything and wrote it back, rather than trying to put it into HNC itself. So yeah, it would probably make more sense to just have a client-side tool that just did it all in one go.
Yeah, I think I realize the problem. So yeah, changing group is very difficult. It's more difficult than changing the version. Now I realize.
Yeah, because it counts as a completely new CRD. So I can't say that I'm really excited by that idea. So the question would be like, is it worth it? Do we think that?
I think the Kubernetes community needs to think about the problem. So if we have if we define something and if we want to formally switch it, which means the old one is completely not compatible, that's horrible.
Yeah, and I mean, not just that, right? Like switching it would also mean a lot more red tape and overhead for any changes, which is also, I mean, it's good and bad, but since we're not really core Kubernetes,
do you have to change it? So
no, so yeah, we have the choice, right? So right now we're x/k8s. Yeah. And we have because we did a formal API review in order to become a sub-project, now we have the choice to basically go to k8s.io. So it'll be hnc.k8s. But what that means is any API change or improvement or feature would basically have to follow the KEP process and a full API review for every change. But if we keep x.k8s, then we don't really need to do that because we're considered separate. And so
I see. Yeah. Okay. It's up to you guys, but sounds like I may prefer just keep X. It depends, how many users actually, and also depends how many API changes are you guys planning to do?
I don't know of any changes that we have right now that we're planning, but things will likely come up.
Yeah, it has pros and cons. I think,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Kubernetes without X sounds more formal and it's more exciting.
Well, yeah, that's what I was saying. It gives us more swagger,
Yeah, it is true. It's pretty cool to have that k8s.io, but yeah, I'm not ruling it out yet by any means.
So yeah, so Andrew, do you know how many actually the users are going to be affected by it? So it depends based on your knowledge, how many users?
We've had, let's see. We've had a couple hundred downloads of the client-side tool, which is probably the best indication as to how many people are using it. Yeah, so we've had like the most recent version of HNC, which was 0.6. Well, we just released 0.7, but that one's still ramping up. 0.6 got to about 200, so did 0.5. So there's probably about 200 people out there using it. It's hard to tell from like how many clusters there are using it because people don't get back to me. I can just tell when somebody downloads it. The YAML files have been downloaded many more times, but it could be like just reinstalling on the same cluster. So it's hard to tell.
Yeah. Okay. So do you know any actual production build on top of that? I think that's probably the key.
I don't think anybody's using it for production because we haven't really recommended that until fairly recently. And even then, like the Google supported version of this is still in beta, so we're not recommending it for production yet. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's maybe a good time if you really want to switch group name. That's exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess for just full disclosure, right? Like we're using it internally for our dev systems, and we hope to eventually use it for production. But you know, we're kind of waiting for it to be ready.
Yeah, based on my own experiences is if you have something put in production, almost impossible to change group. You have to figure out the way to do the conversion. But before that, it's okay to change the group.
Yeah, it's a thought. Yeah, we could just release a new version of HNC that used all the new names and just say, here's a tool that copies everything from one to the other. And that would probably work fairly well.
Yeah, maybe if you don't have, many API changes, maybe it's okay. It's all about if you have API changes, you don't want to go through all the tedious process, whether you want to do that or not.
And the other thing is we are still an alpha API, so that might give us, Brian, do you know if that makes anything easier?
Well, I mean, I guess, well, right, like kind of, because eventually when we move to a beta API, we're going to rev our groups anyway. And so there'll be a change and there'll be a migration. So, I mean, basically that, it's a guarantee that the API will change once we move to a beta. It's just how much work, and obviously we can transition alpha easier.
I'm not sure that's exactly true, because when you go from alpha to beta, you keep the group the same. Like the version changes, but the versions are all within the same CRD. And you can write a template between them. If you're changing the group itself, then you can't write a webhook. It has to be some other kind of scheme.
Yeah, and I mean, I've talked to a few people, and a lot of them basically said, X-K8s is probably what would be better for us. And if we did decide to move to K8s.io, we could basically do the work we did now for our transition. It's not fun, but it could be a one-time thing, of we will migrate to the new CRD.
Yeah, I think
it seems to be kind of,
I think the migration may be okay, but it depends. So, Adrian, for the HNC CR, does it has any very disruptive operations like delete things? If you delete row CR,
if you delete an anchor, then it can delete a namespace. So yeah, we'd have to think through it quite carefully.
Right.
That's a thing.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Other than that, no, I think that's the only really destructive one. Everything else is reversible. That's the only one that's hard to reverse or can't be reversed.
Yeah, the way that we probably we just stop the controller, change the CR.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. If you stop the controller, then nothing will happen.
Stop the controller, delete it. As long as you don't have the owner reference kind of thing, that's a harder thing. If you really have it.
We don't use owner references. We do have finalizers though. So if you stop the controller,
okay, but owner reference is hard. You don't want to stop everything. Yeah, that's technically possible.
Yeah, you know what the right thing to do is, and sorry, I'm gonna have to leave in a moment. Probably to write a design doc, just showing like how you would do it if we wanted to transition, and then we can talk specifically about if we think that's worth it.
Another option too, Adrian, I just thought of this. We have that special annotation that we said that say this is managed externally. You could just go through and write all that to the existing tree to prevent any changes while you migrate.
Oh yeah, that would be a way to increase safety for sure. So
anyway,
you know what? I'll in the no promises as to when, probably by the end of January, but I'll start a design doc on what to do about this. I've just had some other things at work that I need to finish up first. Okay, sorry folks, I'm gonna have to hop off, but I think we're at time anyway.
Yep. Thanks everybody, and chat soon.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.